When the organization told me that the theme of this symposium would be solving a puzzle, I thought, well, we can consider it a jigsaw puzzle, but at the same time, I think with a jigsaw puzzle, each piece has its own fixed position. And what if we would consider solving this puzzle not by a jigsaw puzzle, but by a puzzle with moving tiles? This means that the tiles in this puzzle can move back and forth or up and down. And I thought of this puzzle. It's called Rush Hour. You can see the red car over here, and you can see the exit over here. But the exit is blocked. And the aim of this puzzle is to move all the cars in such a way that this red car can escape from the parking lot. So if this is the way to antibiotic-free production, these are all the obstacles we have to deal with. So why would we try to promote antibiotic reduction in the first place? Antibiotics were used, I think no one can deny the importance for human and veterinary medicine. But knowing that, I would like to emphasize on the difference when you use antibiotics to treat sick people or sick animals, or when you use it as an antimicrobial growth promoter. And this use of antibiotics as an AGP started already soon after the introduction of antibiotics, already in the 1940s. And farmers saw that animals produced much more efficiently when their animals were treated with antibiotics, even in the absence of clinical disease. Furthermore, researchers saw that this effect was almost absent in germ-free animals. And this already gives an indication that there is a clear association between production efficiency and the presence of a microflora. There are some issues when you use antibiotics in animal production. One of the first that drew attention was the presence of residues, antimicrobial residues. And this could have been caused by just a lack of information. If you do not know the metabolic pathway of an antibiotic, you run the risk of residues accumulating in animal end products. Another reason can be that the antibiotic was not used according to prescription, or that the withdrawal time was not complied with. Furthermore, perhaps a thing that is overlooked for some time, animals can also ingest metabolites through ingestion of feces. Anyway, with this residue problem is a part of the antibiotics that were used for the proper reasons, so to say. But the situation is different when you use antibiotics as an AGP. With that, you deliberately are not using it according to prescription because you use it in animals that are not clinically ill. Furthermore, the withdrawal time is deliberately not complied with because it's used for a prolonged period of time instead of just a 3 to 5 days treatment period. And there are other problems associated with the use of AGPs. Of course, there's a public health problem. The resistance of bacteria, which was already thoroughly explained by the previous speaker. And as he already indicated, this is not a new issue. I mean, the things we are facing now, it's not new. It was already recognized in the 1950s. There are already publications from the 1950s indicating that resistant bacteria can become a problem. And this was the reason that Sweden was the first country to implement very strict regulations on the use of antibiotics. And this was the basis for the ban on AGPs in the whole of Europe in 2006. And resistant bacteria should not be underestimated. These are a few pictures from a European network on the surveillance of antimicrobial resistance. They give an annual report, and I collected 5 reports indicating Klebsiella resistance to cephalosporins. And this bacterium is an important cause of urinary tract infections and respiratory infections in humans. And you can see over the years, from 2009, 11, 12, 13 to 14, that there is a tremendous increase in the prevalence of resistant Klebsiella. But also in animal production, resistance is not to be underestimated. These are data from Italy, fairly recent, from 2012 to 2014, indicating a high level of resistance to amoxicillin. It was already high in 2012, it's still high in 2014. Moreover, you can see a rather thorough increase in the resistance to enrofloxacin and flumioquine. So it's something we have to take into account. And then that brings us back to the microbiota. When chicks hatch, they have a nearly sterile gut, which means that they are very susceptible to colonization for either commensals or pathogens. And also this order of colonization is rather specific. You can see already 2 to 4 hours post-hatch, there's colonization of Enterobacteriaceae and Streptococci. You can also see that the lactobacilli are more abundant in the small intestines, whereas anaerobes are more present in the ceca. But after hatch, there's still a development going on. Therefore, I included 2 pictures. This one is from a 7-day-old bird, and the next one will be from a 35-day-old bird. Let's move back to the 7-day-old bird again. These are all bacteria belonging to the phylum of Firmicutes. These are the most abundantly present in chickens. And when you separate these Firmicutes and separate the families present, you can see that in the ileum, the Clostridiaceae are most abundant, whereas in the cecum, it's mainly Clostridiaceae and Ruminococcaceae. Just compare it with this 35-day-old bird. Now you can see that the most abundant family present in the ileum is Lactobacilli. And also the diversity in the cecum has increased. These pictures are not meant to give to you to memorize them. It's just to show that the composition is not stable on day 0. There's a development going on. And this normal intestinal flora is very much beneficial because they stimulate overall health and development of the immune system. They provide some nutrients, for example, as a result of fermentation. Just think of short-chain fatty acids. And they also protect from pathogens through competitive exclusion. And they stimulate host defense by the production of mucus. Unfortunately, it also comes at a cost, because the microflora also competes for nutrients with the host. And they also, so fermentation of certain nutrients leading to short-chain fatty acids can be beneficial, but at the same time, fermentation of protein, for example, can produce toxic metabolites. They are also involved in impaired fat digestibility, and I will show you that in a few slides. And mucus secretion is beneficial from one point of view, but it also costs energy, especially taking into account that mucus contains threonine. So producing lots of mucus requires certain amino acids. And last but not least, they cause low-grade inflammatory responses in the intestinal tract. So this is where AGPs come into focus. Because if you want to counteract the negative effects of the microflora, you should think of a modes of action that can help reduce those negative effects. And the proposed mode of action of AGPs is that they reduce the number of potential pathogens, but also the production of toxic compounds. And by reducing the overall number of bacteria, you can also reduce the competition with nutrients. More indirect effects include a thinner intestinal wall, lower endogenous losses, and a faster nutrient uptake. So, just think, could it be that a ban on AGPs would change the ideal amino acid profile? Because there is a different load on the animal. And I would also like to give to you to think, AGPs are used in a very low dose level. They are used below the minimum inhibitory concentration, which means that a pure antimicrobial effect is unlikely. It is possible that other modes of actions were also in place. For example, anti-inflammatory effects. I will not go into detail about that. It's just for you to think about and to discuss, and we can discuss it perhaps later today. So, if we want antibiotic reduction, it's recommended to implement an overall concept. Do not just take out the antibiotic and replace it for any ordinary additive. It's recommended to implement a whole concept. And for that, I would like to show this analogy with the methods that food technologists apply to reduce the microbial load in food, to increase shelf life. For example, let's take the second one. This could, for example, be chick quality. This one could, for example, be hygiene or biosecurity. This one could be ventilation, for example, temperature at arrival. The next hurdle could be feed composition, nutrients, feedstuff quality, and in the end, management skills as well. So this is just an idea to show this analogy, that it's not a matter of just changing one thing, but you have to change the whole system, like a sliding puzzle. The first hurdle is management. You've already seen some pictures on the use of antibiotics in the Netherlands. Apart from that, we also monitor why antibiotics were prescribed. So we have a clear insight in the reasons that antibiotics were used in broiler production. And in 2014, 18% of all antibiotics were used due to first week problems. I already discussed the next hurdles like hygiene, biosecurity, but vaccination strategy could also be something to consider. Feed composition and also coccidiosis and necrotic enteritis control. So, if we go back to this proposed mode of action of AGPs, one of them was mentioned to reduce the formation of toxic compounds. And these harmful metabolites are produced when protein is fermented by bacteria. And this protein fermentation is associated with viscous diets, so high viscosity leads to an increased risk of protein fermentation. And this high viscosity is caused by certain soluble NSPs. Not all NSPs cause an increased viscosity, but certain soluble NSPs do. And with that, there's a longer transit time, which provides nutrients for bacteria. So in this area, there can be a local overgrowth of the microflora, which can lead to protein fermentation. The superscripts have changed somewhat. I think in your handouts they are still in the right position. This research showed the effect of antibiotics in a wheat barley diet, or in a wheat barley diet that was even fortified with pectin to increase viscosity. And what antibiotics do is that they tighten the junctions. They decrease the leakage of the gut. And you can see that in the wheat barley diet there was a significant decrease in the permeability when you use antibiotics. And this effect was even stronger in the wheat barley diet that had also pectin. I already pointed out that the presence of the microflora plays a key role here. Because in germ-free animals, the effects that were previously described are almost absent. Take, for example, this experiment where they tested germ-free animals and they measured protein nitrogen retention. And they used a maize diet, the yellow bar, and a maize diet with highly methylated citrus pectin. So the treatment with the blue bar had an increased viscosity. And you can see no difference at all in nitrogen retention between these two diets. However, in normal birds, the birds that we have to deal with, the conventional birds, you saw a tremendous decrease, a significant decrease in nitrogen retention when the diets were high in viscosity. This brings us to the next question. Is it a matter of just nitrogen supply, or could it also be nitrogen or protein quality? Therefore, this experiment was designed. And keep in mind, this was an experiment from 1999, so this was still in a period where we were allowed to use AGPs in feed. Nevertheless, Schothorst performed this experiment, and the aim was to compare diets that had the same digestible lysine level all over, but we tried to create a contrast in the crude protein level. And we did that by using different feedstuffs. So, remember, low crude protein means high quality protein source. And the high crude protein treatment means a lower quality protein source. And what they saw was that in diets that had AGPs in feed, there were no differences in body weight gain. And there were no significant differences in feed conversion ratio. However, in the situation where no AGPs were used, there was a tremendous decrease in body weight gain and also a tremendous increase in feed conversion ratio. So the conclusion from this experiment and from these results is that protein quality becomes more important if you have to deal with a situation that you cannot use AGPs or when you are not allowed to use antibiotics. So it's also protein quality, feedstuff quality that plays a role. This is when everything goes right. There's dietary protein, there's pancreatic protease available, There's perhaps also some brush border enzymes available. They degrade protein particles to amino acids. They can be absorbed in blood, that's it. But if there's microbiota present, for example, in the terminal ileum, where you would aim to reduce the protein content, if there's microbiota present, they can use this protein as a substrate, start to ferment it, and in the end they produce toxic metabolites which can have a direct damaging effect on the intestinal wall. And the presence of microbiota in a viscous diet is also indicated in this table. These were diets, a control diet and a diet with NSPs. And you can see that in the ileum, the production of volatile fatty acids was significantly increased. So this also shows that with a high viscous diet, you increase the probability of local microbial overgrowth with all negative consequences as such. I mentioned briefly in some previous slides that mucus production is in some ways a protection mechanism of the animal, but it is also energetically costly. And this shows that a diet that had, again, highly methylated citrospectine had a significant increase in the mucus production. So in one way, the animal tries to protect itself, but in the other way, it has to invest in mucus production. Mucus contains threonine, and this creates very beneficial circumstances for Clostridium perfringens, for example, because Clostridium perfringens is mucolytic. So if there's a local increase in mucus production, there's a risk of Clostridium perfringens. And by that, there's also there can be a change in the threonine requirements. So to keep this protein fermentation under control, it's very important to use a balanced protein concept, which means that protein should be fed as closely as possible to the requirements. And fortunately, we have synthetic amino acids available, so the flexibility to formulate diets that are close to the requirements of the animals increases. So your conclusion could be, well, then there's no problem at all. So if we have these synthetic amino acids, we should be able to control this problem. But for that, I would like to show you this graph. The solid lines indicate the requirement on essential amino acids throughout the production period. But we do not feed a different feed every day. At best, we have a certain feeding phases, which can be 3-phase or 4-phase or 5-phase. And this graph shows you the impact on protein availability. For example, if you have a 3-phase feeding program, which is this line. This means that in this period, there's a relative excess of crude protein. And also in this period. And also in this period. And with a 5-phase feeding program, you can shorten these periods of relative excess, but they are not completely gone. So this is something for you to keep in mind. Even though we try to do our best to formulate as closely as possible to the requirements, just by using certain feeding phases does not guarantee that you have no longer an excess of protein. Not only does a high viscosity diet have an impact on nitrogen retention, as we saw a few slides ago, it also affects starch digestibility. And in this respect, it is important to realize that in this situation, where starch digestibility is significantly worse compared to the ordinary maize diet, that this excess of undigested starch can also act as an NSP. So this can further worsen the situation. Having a normal microflora is okay. Feeding protein is okay. When this is out of balance, you may come into problems. And due to this protein fermentation and nutrients available for the microbiota, there's also an effect on fat digestibility, but this is a more indirect effect. Just have a look at this graph. This is a normal situation where you have dietary fat, which is broken down by lipase into fatty acids and monoglycerides, which can be absorbed. But there's a role of bile salts. And these bile salts, they help emulsifying large fat particles. And by doing that, lipase can act more efficiently. So, if there's microbiota present, they have this particular characteristic that they can deconjugate bile salts. So by that, they can deactivate this emulsifying activity of bile salts, which reduces fat digestibility. So this is more an indirect effect, but cannot be ignored. And this is also the reason that when you come into when you have a broiler flock with intestinal health problems, you will see like fatty excreta. This is an indication that fat digestibility was impaired, and this is the background. This is again shown in this graph, where an increase in the log bacteria increases the percentage of deconjugation. Well, I think this is the last slide on the germ-free versus conventional animals. And this also showed decreased fat digestibility. So we're talking about fat sources, or fat digestibility, sorry. And we already discussed protein quality, protein sources. Now I would like to focus on fat sources. This was an experiment done where they tested three fat sources: animal fat, coconut oil, and soy oil. And they had an Ameria acephalina challenge at day 18. So fat digestibility was measured on day 16 before the challenge, and there were hardly any differences. Fat digestibility was high regardless of the fat source. However, birds were infected on day 18, and fat digestibility was again measured on day 23. And here you can see that especially the animal fat had an extremely low fat digestibility. This shows that depending on the situation, a certain fat source can help, can improve, or can worsen the situation. Also, the effects on production performance were not to be ignored. So average daily gain was decreased and feed conversion ratio was tremendously increased. Let's now focus on something else. We've talked about nutrients. We've talked about feed composition and feedstuffs, different sources. Let's now focus on gizzard development. It's a rather new topic. It started in the 1990s, more or less, where they found that well-developed gizzards had a beneficial effect on intestinal health. So the function of the gizzard was, for a long time, they were just considered as a grinding organ. But the gizzard does much more. Of course, it grinds feed, it mixes feed, and it releases particles to the duodenum when the particles are small enough. And for a long time, it was thought that particles of about 1 millimeter at minimum size would be sent off to the duodenum. But more recent research showed that particles are even smaller. So this grinding activity of the gizzard is very important. Of course, it speaks for itself that with more structural feed components, such as fibers, that requires a more thorough grinding of the gizzard, so that stimulates gizzard development. And as a result, there is more reflux from the gizzard to the proventriculus, back and forth, but also from the duodenum back into the gizzard. So with that, there's a more intense mixing of gastric juices, and there is a longer retention time in the gizzard. And this whole complex of gizzard development, grinding and mixing, and exposure to gastric juices improves intestinal health. You can distinguish a macro and a micro structure when you're feeding pellets. The macro structure is the pellet itself, so to say. Whereas the microstructure is the particles that build the pellet. And it's shown that when it comes to gizzard development, it's more important to focus on the microstructure than on the macrostructure. Because due to the wet environment in the gizzard, particles the macrostructure of the pellet will the pellet will fall apart very quickly in the gizzard. So the remaining microstructure of the pellet is more important when it comes to gizzard development. Pelleting in itself has also a tremendous impact on the size of the particles. Even if you have a pre-pellet mesh with large particles, just the mere pelleting process already decreases the particle sizes. And this is especially the case in the larger particles. You can, for example, the two left ones are the mesh diets, and the two bars on the right are the pelleted diets. And especially in the particles with a size of 1.4, there you can see a tremendous difference after pelleting. So this is a take-home message. Even if you think your pre-pellet mesh has a sufficient particle size, just the pelleting process itself already decreases the particle size. So if you want to do something on gizzard development, and if you want to use larger particles, you should think of measures such as feeding whole wheat. I know this is a typical feeding strategy in Western Europe. It's not allowed in every country. Not even feeding wheat is allowed in all countries. But if you're talking about implementing a whole concept and trying to improve gizzard development, this is something you have to keep in mind. This is also very nice research where they compared a fine mesh and a coarse mesh, and a fine pellet and a coarse pellet. So it's more like a 2x2 experiment. And they found that there was indeed an effect of grinding. So with a coarse mesh, there's a significant more gizzard development compared to the fine mesh. The same with the pellets. The coarse pellet had significantly more developed gizzards than the fine pellet. However, the mesh had a much bigger impact than the pellet. So this indicates that feed form is more important has a larger impact than the effect of grinding. And these pictures show how gizzards can look after feeding a pelleted diet, a mesh diet, or a pellet with 20% whole wheat. And it also shows that, for example, the proventriculus has a higher risk of dilatation when you feed very fine particles. This is not a one-on-one relationship. I've seen those dilated gizzards even when birds were fed mesh diets, but I must say this mesh had a very fine structure. So in summary, we were talking about implementing a whole concept to reduce the use of antibiotics. Management is number one. Of course, avoiding environmental stress is of key importance, but to me it almost sounds like an open door. Using sufficient large particles, but also particles that are sufficiently large is important. Viscosity is by far a very high risk factor for intestinal health problems. So if you can do something to reduce this viscosity, this will improve intestinal health. And also a balanced amino acid concept. So highly digestible protein sources, and try to reduce protein as a substrate for the microbiota. But this is easier said than done, probably, because all feeding tables were developed and designed and tested in healthy chickens. So, and I already mentioned that when mucus production increases, also the threonine requirement increases. So this leads us to think that perhaps we should also develop feeding tables for animals that are not in optimum condition. And this also emphasizes the importance of good nutrient requirements in a situation where you cannot use antibiotics, or where you cannot use antibiotics to correct a situation that had gone wrong. And also something to think about, the ionophore anticoccidials are under attack. And all in Norway, I think there were also people from Norway here, they can perhaps elaborate on that. In Norway, all of a sudden, Narizin, for example, was banned. And because Scandinavia had has shown, historically seen, that regulations that were implemented there were on many occasions also the basis for EU-wide measures. I think we have to keep in mind that ionophore anticoccidials could be banned in future sometimes, who knows. So this even more enforces the importance of having this whole concept ready. So, how can we slide these tiles in the puzzle? For example, no, not for example, it's just a conclusion. When you have to deal with a situation where you cannot use AGPs, or where you have to reduce even a therapeutic use of antibiotics, it reduces the degrees of freedom for the farmer, for the nutritionist, for the veterinarian. And this requires, first of all, better management, but also a stronger focus of the nutritionist on feed composition, feed structure, feed quality, feedstuff quality. So it's recommended to have an integrated approach, not just taking out an antibiotic and replace it for a regular additive, although additives can assist. It's important to implement an overall concept. So this puzzle can be solved. And I would like to challenge you, if you would like to try it for yourself. I have the rush hour puzzle with me. So if you want to try it, and try if you can solve this puzzle, you're welcome. I would just like to conclude with a few slides on the situation in the Netherlands, because we have many clients, international clients, and they look at the Netherlands and they say, how can you still have an efficient broiler production when you cannot use AGPs and when you have to, and when even the therapeutic antibiotics have to be reduced? Well, this shows that the antibiotic sales has decreased tremendously. And this shows that the use in broilers has also decreased substantially. So it is possible. But now your remark could be, well, your production must have suffered. I will come to that later. And there are also some critical, we hear some critical remarks that, well, this antibiotic resistance is not due to the use of AGPs in animal production. Well, this shows the cefotaxime resistance in E. coli. And you can see a tremendous decrease in the broilers. And production performance has not suffered. Has suffered perhaps a bit, but based on quantitative data from the Netherlands, you can see that when this discussion on the use of therapeutic antibiotics started in 2010, feed conversion ratio has decreased since. And average daily gain has also increased since. So it's still feasible to have an efficient broiler production even in the absence of antibiotics. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ellen. I will try for sure this evening to solve the sliding puzzle, but maybe I need a couple of beers for that if I want to succeed. So, let's open the question and answer. Lars.
Ellen, in the beginning you had a statement there where you said that 18% of the AGPs were used in the first week for the broilers.
Not AGPs.
No, sorry, yeah. That's a complete underestimation.
Probably.
Let me take you on a mathematical excursion. Let's say 18% there. But what is that time of a broiler? It is 1/5 of a normal life, 20%, 18%, that's equal. What is it on the use of feed? 6-7% in the first week? If you take that 6-7% times 18% makes you 300% of the problems are in the first week that we address with medicines.
These data were...
it's just a mathematical excursion.
These data were collected. On-farm use is monitored. Also the prescription by veterinarians is monitored. And this was an overview. When antibiotics are prescribed, a veterinarian has to record why they were prescribed. For example, due to locomotion problems, respiratory problems, intestinal health problems, or first week problems. So you already see that there can be an overlap in the first week. Of course, you can have locomotion problems in the first week or intestinal health problems in the first week. This was just to show that I agree with you, it could be an underestimation and there is an overlap because I'm not sure if a veterinarian can tick 2 boxes, for example. But this shows that if you want to correct something like that, a first week problem with feed whereas feed consumption is still very low. I think it's more likely that management should be improved compared to feed or nutrition. So this points to the fact that management is of key importance, because this is the first week. Anything going wrong there will hamper you throughout the production period.
Erica, just to help you on that, I think it depends very much on what the situation is in individual countries and individual companies. When you get older in life, you'll use much more antibiotics if you have to use them, particularly if you're using them in feed. So it depends how much prophylactic use and how much therapeutic use there is. But also, just to clarify your situation in Norway, and my colleagues here will perhaps sort of hopefully agree with what I'm going to say, Norway has not banned the use of ionophores. What they've done is they've voluntarily withdrawn that as producer groups or as the individual companies. And that doesn't take away from the concern that you've raised, which there is a risk on ionophores. There's no doubt about that. The US certainly regard ionophores as antibiotics, and although there's many different definitions of antibiotic-free, one of the main definitions of antibiotic-free is no ionophores. So there is a risk there, but I just want to clarify the situation in Norway.
Thank you.
So this means that the Norwegians are harming themselves voluntarily. Yeah, it's just a joke. Just a joke.
Well, you can also think it from a different perspective. I mean, by excluding or voluntarily excluding the use of ionophores, there was a tremendous increase in the vaccination. Even so much that it was almost impossible to get a paracox vaccine for us in the Netherlands, because all vaccines were shipped to Norway. Perhaps this is our future. I don't know.
Other questions? Yep.
Hello. Just looking at your pie charts of your gut flora and how it changes from 7 days to 35 days, I just wondered if you knew what impact using antibiotics before 7 days had on that 35-day gut flora profile?
It was not in this publication, but you can imagine that by using antibiotics, especially in the first week, you decrease the total number of bacteria, but you also decrease the variation in the population that's present. I'm not sure if an animal, especially a broiler, in 35 days is able to completely go to the normal flora if you treat them in the first week. There are many indications that they cannot. So that by treating them in the first week, you already affect the composition of the flora in later life. I cannot tell now if this affects production performance, but I know from former colleagues who were in immunology, they tested this and they saw tremendous differences. So that it was very difficult for broilers to go back to this stable microflora after they were treated with antibiotics.
Do you have any information about the use of enzymes in the feed, such as xylonas, phytas, in such growing of ABF flocks?
I think the use of xylonases, glucanases, is almost has become standard. Of course, there are different products on the market. There are different premixes with different products present. In general, you can say that enzymes need substrate. So if you provide substrate where the enzymes can act upon, they will be active. It's a similar situation with phytase. Using phytase in a diet without phytate doesn't make any sense. So it's a similar situation with glucanases and xylanases. Although I must say that we have certain standards where we say, well, above a certain inclusion level of, for example, wheat or barley, you should use xylanases or glucanases. But we see more and more that nutritionists do not take any risks. They just include xylanases and glucanases, regardless of the exact inclusion level of wheat and barley, for example.
Other questions? We have time for the last one. Yep.
First, thank you for your useful presentation. I have one question about, do you have experience with different type of corn in compound feed, semi-flint or some type of corn with higher content of viper starch, and the impact of healthy status, gut status, and reduce antibiotics, and of course the production results?
That's a very interesting question. We do not have experience as such, although as Schotter's Feed Research, we regularly update our tables, and we also use feedstuffs from different origins. But in the end, we still come up with one figure. So it's not like only when we can distinguish certain varieties in maize, for example, we can we have different requirements and different recommendations. It's very interesting that you mentioned, for example, the maize, because I know the distribution of amylose and amylopectin determines starch digestibility. And I know that there are varieties of maize that have a different composition, that they contain, for example, more amylopectin than amylase. And due to the difference in structure, amylose is more resistant to enzymatic degradation than amylopectin. So you certainly have a point that with different varieties of grains or maize, there can be a difference in digestibility. So, and in general, better digestible feedstuffs help in maintaining intestinal health. A good point.
The very last question. I have a question for you, Ellen. A very practical one. So, saying that the first week of life is very important in terms of growth of the animals, and saying also that starting from 2000 we had to stop the use of meat and bone meal, increasing the level of soybean meal in the diet. Do you think it's possible to formulate, or have you ever experienced in your institute the formulation of a diet completely without soybean meal? And if this can give a return on investment in terms of growth later on?
To my knowledge, we have not completely replaced soybean meal. But of course, there are concerns about production of soybeans, carbon footprint issues, etc. And the production of locally produced protein sources has gained interest. So part of our research was indeed dealing with the use of, for example, sunflower seed meal, rapeseed meal. So by increasing these, partly replacing soybean meal for other protein-rich sources. But completely without soybean meal, to my knowledge, we haven't tested that.
Okay.
Especially, it is almost impossible, especially because we cannot use animal protein. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you can use maybe high concentrate source of proteins like peas, potatoes, or even soybean meal.
Yeah, but you said when you want to replace soybean meal.
Yeah, but soybean meal, in my opinion, is the normal soybean meal that brings also some high level of antigen factors in the gut and can create some stress in the gut. So replacing this soybean meal with something high concentrated in protein, but with low level of anti-nutritional factors.
Yeah, when you refer to potato protein, that could be an alternative, although that will not be a very cost-effective alternative. So it's always a balance of requirements of the bird, costs, etc.
Okay, so thank you very much, Ellen, for your presentation.